The review today will be about just clarifications of what we've discussed. Nothing new. I will just run through each and every one of these three concepts. And since there are only 6 of you, you can stop me at any time and we can just clarify any specific point that you want clarification in. But I thought it best to start with Ricardian equivalence and focus on the clarification of this important concept in macroeconomics. Now, no problem. Okay, so this review is basically just going through each and every one of these three concepts again. And I thought I would just give examples, at least for Ricardian equivalence, so that it'll become clearer. For exchange rate-based and money-based stabilization, what we'll do is we'll tell the story of how the stabilization policy works, so you'd have a better understanding of how to implement it in a sense. So let's begin with Ricardian equivalence. First of all, what's the definition of Ricardian equivalence? It just implies, yes. The tax will be, taxation as a policy will be equivalent to, not really the temporal concept of it, but which other policy? Issuing what? Well, you're almost there. What do you need? Why do you need taxes? In order to generate revenue. There's another way to generate revenue. And so Ricardian equivalence tells you exactly that taxation is equivalent to issuing bonds. Now, how exactly does taxation become equivalent to issuing bonds? Well, as a policy of generating revenue, Ricardian equivalence is telling you that whether or not you issue a bond now or increase the tax collection in a country does not matter, because eventually these two will become equal. And now I'll tell you a story of how that happens. Now let's say a country has government expenditure G1 at time 1. And so you can think of this as a timeline. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on until infinity. Okay? Now, government expenditure at time 1 will be G1. Government expenditure at time 2 will be G2, and so on and so forth. Now, for a perfectly balanced budget, what must G1 be equal to? For a perfectly balanced budget, which means the government is not in deficit. What? Exactly, tax revenues, right? And we will name that T1. Okay? And so, if this government is in balance every year from 1 until infinity, then each and every one of these G's must equal each and every one of these T's. Okay? Now, if you have a government that is set up this way, then you don't have the problem of deficit spending, because there is no debt accumulating, and there is no deficit at any point in time. The budget is always in balance. But the world is not as simple as that. Sometimes G1 will be greater than V1. That's when you have a deficit. And if you don't pay for that deficit, essentially this differential, G1 minus T1, will be carried over with interest as you move along the timeline. So this initial deficit is increased by any further deficits at any points in time. That's one way to increase it. And so it increases with additional deficits. And it also increases with what? Exactly. Okay. And that is how a deficit balloons. Now let's analyze a certain policy. So I'll just erase it. Let's say that your economy is in a balanced budget mode, which we have here. And let's say at a certain point in time, let's say at G1, you decide not to balance the budget. Let's say now that your taxes have been cut in such a way that G1 is now greater than P1. Okay? And so G1 minus P1 is called a tax cut. Right? Let's say this is the policy that you want to implement. You want to implement a deficit financed tax cut. Now, there's another way that you can cut taxes. A non-deficit financed tax cut, which means that it's just, if it's non-deficit financed, it means that your G1 is still equal to your T1, the taxes that you do collect, but there is an extra that you could just have cut without creating a deficit. Right? Here you have a deficit financed tax cut because now your G1 is greater than your T1, and yet you still cut the taxes. Right? And so if this is what you do, you need to get the money from somewhere else. Okay? And that somewhere else is called the bond market. Okay? You issue a bond. And so this deficit financed tax cut, okay, the deficit itself is funded by a bond issue. Okay, now if you issue the bond, let's call that bond B1. Okay? So essentially, what happens in this scenario? The government collects P1, but P1 is less than G1, so you need a B1 to balance your expenditures. So essentially, G1 is equal to T1 plus B1 by our definition. Right? Any questions so far? This is designed to make everything clearer, so please stop me if something is unclear. Okay. So this is what you have in the first period. What happens in the second period? If you don't retire that bond, if you don't pay for the bond itself, because you need to pay for the bond. Essentially, I give you a piece of paper in period 1, I'm the government. Okay, I owe you B1 to be paid later on with interest. In the second period, if you give me back the paper and say, okay, I want my money now, I must give you B1 times 1 plus R. Right? Now, if you don't want it in the second period, then you can still hold on to the bond in the second period, and I will still keep on spending the same way, and the deficit will still be there, or the debt will still be there. Okay? Now, let's say, so if you want to retire the bond at the second period, I need to pay you B1, 1 plus R. If you want to retire the bond on the third period, how much must I pay you?
B1 plus R squared.
Exactly. In the fourth period, B1, 1 plus R, fourth, right? Cube. Right. And so let's say we retire it on the fourth period. Right? Right? Let's say we want to retire this bond on the fourth period. And so it was a 4-year bond, like a long-term bond from the government. If you want to retire it on the fourth period, G4 equals P4, okay, does not change. What you will spend on the fourth period, G4, let's assume, is still equal to what you would have been taxing, T4. Except now, you need to retire a bond worth B1 1 plus R cubed. So, how much should this change by? You must increase the tax by the B1 1 plus R cubed. Otherwise, you will not be able to retire the bond. Right? And so, you might think, well, this is a tricky method of generating revenues. You cut taxes in the first period, but eventually, you pay for that cut by taxing them anyway. And so, taxes on the fourth period, T4 prime, if you retire it there, is T4, that thing which equals G4, plus the value of the bond which you need to retire, B1 1 plus R cubed. Oh, let me remind you, by the way, that you're not responsible for this kind of math. Right? This is just an explanation of how it works. And so this will be the new tax rate in the fourth period. And so you can see something sneaky is happening here. In the first period, you cut taxes. People are more well off. They have more money. But you issued a bond. It's an IOU. I owe you something on the fourth period. I will pay you this amount. But that thing you issued, you don't have money to pay for it. And so you must eventually increase the taxes anyway to pay for that bond. Therefore, if you are a rational individual in this economy, you see the government cut taxes, but it is a deficit finance tax cut. What do you do with the tax cut? What do you do with that amount of taxes that has not been collected? As an individual. Exactly. Why do you need to save them? Exactly. Because the tax would have been used to pay for that thing anyway. Eventually, this deficit finance tax cut needs to be financed, and you finance that bond issue by taxing them more. And it works out perfectly because if you save the G1 minus D1, which is the tax cut, which is equivalent to B1, it will earn you an interest of R every year. Right? And so B1 is essentially an S1. It's your savings. And you save for that point in time when the government will be collecting the tax. That is why issuing a bond or taxing in this kind of a situation does not matter. It's equivalent. Okay? It's essentially the tax cut, which was financed by a bond issue, will become a tax. There's no difference. Yes?
So knowing that, why does government do a tax cut?
Okay, that is a very good question. There is a big assumption for this model, right? One big assumption is that the government is an infinitely lived organization, infinitely lived individual. What's another big assumption? If this is 4 years, then it is likely that you're going to save the tax cut. What if this is 70 years? Would you save the tax? No, because it's not going to be your problem in 70 years. It's going to be someone else's problem. And so if it's an intergenerational system, where you're not going to be responsible for a tax cut in the 40s, then you're going to want to spend it once you get the tax cut. You're not going to save it. You don't care what the next generation will be facing. You just spend this. And so an assumption here for this to work is an infinitely lived individual, which is obviously not true. There's no such thing. Or individuals who care about the future. Care about the future generations, more specifically. Any questions? Yes?
do you really observe this happening in reality, or doesn't it usually go that way, that the government will just issue a new bond to pay off the old bond?
Oh, that is essentially what you're doing here. If it's a 1-year bond and you need to retire it in the second year, B11 plus R, you can issue another bond equal to B2 whose value is B11 plus R. So I need to pay Vidget B11 plus R. I'll get B2 from you, pay Vidget, and I owe the B2, which is essentially B11 plus R. It's just rolling over. So technically, it doesn't need to be a 4-year bond. It can be a series of 1-year bonds with an increasing face value. But that is true. You can keep on rolling it over. And some brilliant guy, actually, a scam artist, I don't know if he's in England or here in the US, who thought of just rolling over bond issues in order to generate like a scheme of increasing his money or his assets. We're assuming a no Ponzi scheme. His name was Ponzi. So he was just going to issue bonds over and over again so that he doesn't need to pay for it. So as long as there's someone out there who's going to pay for the next bond issue, he would have gotten more and more money. But in the limit, that is not sustainable, right? Otherwise, the developing countries will just keep on borrowing from the IMF, right? But that is not sustainable because in the limit, it must be zero. You must be able to pay for that bond growth. So you see there's a dynamic here. How fast is your ability to generate taxes growing? And how fast is this bond's interest rate growing? So we're obviating from that dynamic. We're assuming the tax is just constant and so is the G. Okay, but that is a very good question. You can essentially keep on issuing more and more bonds as long as your ability to tax increases by a greater amount. Right? And so as long as your economy is growing, then it's okay.
Here you refer to the tax and also to bond.
Yes.
But you just mentioned about the IMF, developing countries get indebted through borrowing from IMF or World Bank.
Yes.
Are facing the same thing too, right?
Yes.
Same mechanism in the sense that they will still have to, they will accumulate this debt if there's no, I would say, they could not manage to have a budget surplus.
Exactly. Exactly. And so essentially, sooner or later, you will need to generate that budget surplus, which is what this is telling you. So that a tax cut in period 1 is essentially just a sacrifice in the future period. That thing which you taxed must earn the same interest rate that you issued so that you will be able to pay for it. But yeah, you can think of this as the government is the guy who's borrowing from the IMF. And so this is like an external sector deal. But here we're thinking of an internal sector within the economy. Yes?
So, what is the general formula for the Ricardian equivalent? Because you can use the different formula to explain the same. So just like the G1 equal G1 plus B1 or before. What is general? Is the formula to
There's no real formula for it. It's just how it works. The Ricardian equivalence theory is how you have a system where taxing or issuing bonds, it's the same thing. That's all the Ricardian equivalence is. And then there are major assumptions like an infinitely lived government, an infinitely lived individual, and there's no wedge between the interest rate that the government issues and the interest rate that you will be able to get. Right? If you save, we're assuming that you get the same rate, R. If that rate is different, then there is something going on here. It will not equal. Right? So we're assuming R there, the bond issue, is the same as the savings rate here that you get from the tax cut. Right? Any other questions?
What is the time duration between
consume farm and eventually increase the tax to pay back
The bond issue, essentially there is no time duration required. As long as you're able to grow faster than your bond issuing rate, or the rate by which your bond issue grows, okay, then there is no time limit. You can essentially generate a huge deficit and still be able to sustain it, as long as you're growing. But for longer periods of time, this theory starts to break down, precisely because no one is infinitely lived, even governments, I would think. Except the strongest governments, the United States. Okay. Yes?
Don't mean that the government must issue the bonds in a very rapid time to replace the former one.
Excuse me?
And then the Ricardian equivalence in some means the government must issue amount of bonds to replace the former ones.
They can do that.
Huh?
They can do that. But
And first, the second, I think it has another meaning. Means if I borrow money from IMF, it is unnecessary to pay.
no, not exactly. This is our point earlier.
I
The
can
no
borrow a new
Ponzi,
one to repay the old one. Right?
the no Ponzi scheme. In the limit, you cannot have that kind of a structure of your debt portfolio where you just keep on rolling over the debt. The Asian crisis is a primary example of that. You cannot just keep on issuing more debt to pay for the old ones. Because essentially, in the limit, which means in infinity, when you extend that kind of a policy, it cannot be a positive number at the end. This is highly theoretical, but you will get the idea. It's really very simple. If you are here at 1999, and this is some very huge year to the right, in the limit, you must be able to pay for all of your debt, which
What's
means,
the deadline?
excuse me,
What is the deadline?
what is the what?
Deadline.
Deadline? This one? That's the thing. There is no deadline. There is no deadline. But people will know if you're trying to do a Ponzi scheme. I'm not exactly, well, see, a Ponzi scheme is discovered. There's two dynamics here that we don't see there. One is bond growth. How fast are you issuing your bonds? And how fast is your debt growing? Debt growth. Your debt, okay, people will allow you more debt only if they think that you will be able to pay for it. Right? And so the thing they will be looking at is your GDP growth. And so essentially, they will give you more money as long as they think that you are good for it. But if they start to think that you're just throwing that money away, which means you're not putting it in productive use, the money that you are getting, you're just consuming now, which will not allow you to produce more in the future. They will stop this debt rollover, and your Ponzi scheme will collapse. You will end up with a very big amount of deficit, which will necessitate a major contraction, a major T, when that Ponzi scheme collapses.
Is there any benchmark, for example, for a country in terms of debt ratio on GDP?
Ooh, I'm not familiar with debt research. I read somewhere that 40-50% is still of GDP is not really that bad. But then again, I don't want to commit that number. I'm not really sure. Okay. So this is the first thing. It's not really simple. The next point is what Dr. Loyo was talking about yesterday. Yeah, Vincent and I were just talking this morning. Dr. Loyo sometimes speaks so quickly. And it's in his nature to do that. He's my professor in macroeconomics here at the Kennedy School, and he really talks fast. So we'll go through what he discussed yesterday much more slowly. See what we can discover.
And we don't have this suffix covered by our textbook.
That is true. It is not in your textbook. It's not there. It's not in mine. Okay. Let me just stress for those of you who just came in, you're not responsible for this, concept. I just wanted to clarify this. Anyway, exchange rate based stabilization. First of all, let's set up the story. What are we trying to accomplish with a stabilization policy? What are we trying to stabilize in the first place? Price, which is essentially inflation. Price growth. Why is it necessary to stabilize inflation? What does inflation do to an economy? Remember, yes?
A lot of bad things.
A lot of bad things, exactly. Too many to count.
Erode salaries, wages, change the behavior of the enterprise. A lot of
You essentially gave me the best answer there. In a market system, what is the price of a good, of a service, of anything? It is a signal to demand, the consumer, and a signal to supply, the producer. Essentially, the market system requires that this price approximate its true value. The price of a good must approximate its true value so that the signal is good. If something is scarce, the price must be high so that people will supply it. And consumers will not consume too much of it so that they will deplete that resource quickly. That's how a market system works. If the price is distorted, the market system becomes distorted as well. Price growth is simply inflation. When you have inflation, this thing becomes distorted. That is why you need to stabilize in a market system. In a command economy, it's very simple to stabilize prices. You can just say, okay, there's no price growth. That is the price of that good. Just set it that way. It's not really that simple, but you have a lot more leeway to set the price. In a market system, you have to control the price. You have to lead it to its true value. That is essentially what you need to do. And so you need policies like exchange rate stabilization, exchange rate based stabilization, or money based stabilization to sort of regulate the price. Bring it back to its true value. Okay, so this is our objective, to control inflation. The first way to control it is through exchange rate based stabilization. Now, the thing to remember about these two things, in order to stabilize price, because price is, that is price, it's bouncing up and down. Let's say this is the true value. Okay. If you have inflation, there's a lot of noise in the market. There's a lot of wrong signals. What you need to do is you need to anchor the price to something. In a market where everything, a change here creates a change there, which creates a change here and there, which creates, there's all of this noise happening. You need an anchor to base your policy on. The first anchor is your exchange rate, and the second anchor is your money supply. If you control one and base your decisions on that controlled variable, then you will be able to stabilize the economy. Okay? So let's just focus on the first anchor, the exchange rate anchor. An exchange rate based stabilization works primarily with this equation in mind. RER equals EP over PF. Now this should look very familiar to you. E is the nominal exchange rate. P is the price of the domestic good in domestic currency terms. I will not write it down anymore. PF is the price of the foreign good in foreign currency terms. RER is the real exchange rate in terms of foreign goods over home goods. E is the nominal exchange rate in terms of the foreign currency over the home currency. Okay? So, given that you have this equation, the first thing you do is you set the real exchange rate is equal to 1. In other words, you assume the law of one price. Okay? If you assume the law of one price, RER becomes 1. 1 equals E P over PF. What you do next is you isolate this thing on one side. P is equal to PF over E. That is essentially what you need to look at. This is where Dr. Loyo got his equation yesterday. Okay? You set RER equals 1, law of one price. Then you isolate P. Now, which of these variables are we really interested in? It's this guy, right? P. When P grows, inflation occurs. Okay. Now, if you want to stabilize P, we can look at these two other variables and choose which one we need to anchor our policy on. Why not choose PF as an anchor?
It's the price of foreign goods.
Exactly.
You cannot control.
Exactly, and so you have no control over it, and so you have no business setting it as the anchor, right? So you choose E, which you have some control over, the nominal exchange rate. You therefore fix this thing, fix the nominal exchange rate, and stabilize P as it relates to PF. That's the exchange rate based stabilization policy. Okay. Now essentially it looks very simple. Right? Fix E, P will adjust to PF and stabilize. Right? And how does this thing stabilize? What is the dynamic? It is through trade. Right? This thing cannot deviate from this if you arbitrage away any possible price differentials. Right? Net of transportation costs and all of those barriers. Yes, Adam?
I'm not sure if I maybe misunderstood part of what you've done. But it seems like it seems like you're recommending switching just from a floating currency to a fixed exchange rate. In which case, this is tenable only while you have enough foreign currency reserves.
Exactly.
Okay.
That is one issue.
And so what? So you actually haven't stabilized P. I mean, you haven't stabilized what's. It doesn't seem like you've changed anything in your economy. You've just changed who's paying for it. Because suddenly currency is flying out of your central bank instead of flying out of people's pockets.
To a certain extent, that is true, but any loss in value, and I'm not trying to show a preference for any one of these policies, but any loss in value of whether that dollar bill in your pocket lost value today because of inflation, or whether that dollar bill was in the Federal Reserve because the government taxed the $1, it's still a loss in value. So it really doesn't matter where the dollar bill is, it will lose value if you don't stabilize. Did I like provide an answer? Not really.
I think you might. It was an interesting answer, but I'm not sure it was the question that I asked.
Yeah,
Maybe it's
sorry.
not that maybe I didn't form the question.
Well,
I'm just sort of baffled. There's something fundamentally wrong in this economy,
mhm.
and I don't know that having the central bank
Just fix the exchange
support the price level or the exchange rate
We'll solve everything.
will solve that problem.
That is true, and I think Dr. Loyo mentioned it yesterday. You cannot assume that this alone will fix the problem of inflation. So exchange rate based stabilization, it's exchange rate based, but there's a lot of other conditionalities in such a stabilization policy. So it's not just the exchange rate. But it is the key because it's the anchor for the policy. Okay, so when you have this scenario, you have what you call a boom-bust cycle. Okay. And this boom-bust cycle occurs precisely because of this exchange rate-based stabilization policy. And this is what we will explain next. Okay. Now, you have several explanations for why there will be a boom if you implement an exchange rate-based stabilization. So the boom part is easy to explain. There are several candidate explanations for it. The first one being the temporariness hypothesis. Temporariness hypothesis. And this occurs, the temporariness of hypothesis occurs because people think that this lull in inflation is only going to be temporary. Okay? Now, if it's only going to be temporary, people will want to take advantage of this stabilization period where all the prices, P, correctly signal the value of goods and services. And so during an exchange rate-based stabilization program, if it does work in the initial period, and it will, most of these programs do work in the initial periods. Once they work, the price will again approximate its true value. And so there is an incentive for you, if you think that it will fail later on, if you think that this is just temporary, to consume goods and services, because they now approximate the true value of the goods and services. That is one explanation for the temporariness hypothesis. The other one, so one is the exact temporariness of it, and the other one is the nominal interest rate is what when you have high inflation?
Hi.
Exactly. Why? Because I is equal to R plus pi E. Right? Now, if you're able to convince everyone that you are going to be able to control expected inflation so that this goes down, then this will go down 1 for 1 with that pi E going down. Or at least that's what the theory tells us. And so if the nominal interest rates go down, what does that signal to you? Why will you consume? What is the nominal interest rate? Why does it matter to an individual?
The cost of holding money is low.
Exactly. The nominal interest rate is the opportunity cost of consumption. If you don't consume today, your money could have been put in a savings account which will earn you the nominal interest rate. And so opportunity cost is going down. If the opportunity cost is going down, you increase the consumption. C. If you increase the consumption, that is the boom part. this part. Right? That's the first reason. Second reason is durable goods. And I think Sergio gave a very good candidate explanation for the durable goods hypothesis. It's because the financial system is again working. People are again able to take out loans for their cars. They want to purchase cars. And so they buy the durable goods during that lull. Right? That, however, is highly dependent on the fact that you expect the exchange rate based stabilization program to work. If you don't expect the exchange rate based stabilization program to work, what would be a candidate explanation for this durable goods hypothesis? If you don't expect, see, Sergio's explanation is contingent upon you expecting the program to work. Because when you buy a car and you have interest financing, let's say in a developing country, you will pay for it in 10, 15 years. This thing can fail within months, the exchange rate based stabilization program, if it's really not going to work. And so you do buy the car, the durable good, only if you expect it to work. Right? And so Sergio's explanation will work if everyone expects the program to work. What if you don't expect the program to work? What is a candidate explanation for the increase in the consumption of durable goods? It could be repressed consumption. Right? People have been languishing with old cars for 10, 20 years, and then suddenly there comes this president who wants to stabilize the prices, and so there is a repressed consumption. You didn't buy the durable good in the past 10 or 20 years, so now you want to buy it while you still can. Okay. The third explanation, income redistribution. Yes?
Did you just say for the first explanation that you're just assuming that your policy worked?
What, this one?
Yeah, can you know for durable goods?
Yes.
What was the first one you said?
Oh, okay.
Before
This
repressed
one
consumption?
is when you have a working financial system. When you have a working financial system and you believe this will work, then you will buy the durable goods. And you usually need a working financial system because you don't just have lots of money to buy durable goods. You need to take out a loan for it. So that's the first one. The second one is repressed consumption. So this is not contingent upon you expecting the program to work. You're just so repressed in terms of consumption that when you do have the lull, you immediately go out and buy the good.
What will work about the second? Yeah.
This one?
The second, yeah.
This one, repressed consumption.
So either way, people still buy.
Yes. And this phenomenon is still unresolved. Economists don't know why people just buy durable goods during periods of stabilization. Okay. The third one is income redistribution. And this is really where economics overlaps the realm of political economy, politics. Because the main objective during a stabilization program is to make the price equal its true value or stabilize the state. Right? Now, what usually happens is when you have a stabilization program, it usually comes with a new government, right? Or a new perspective by government. And so this orientation usually leads them to a more populist point of view. Okay. And if you are more populous, then you also care about this extra concern, income redistribution, and they take advantage of the opportunity to redistribute income in the economy. And this is a very dangerous policy to undertake, because if you want the price to be the true value, if you want to stabilize the price, this is not exactly consistent with that objective. Why? If you have populist concerns and you are trying to inject it into the exchange rate-based stabilization program, what is this doing to the price? First of all, how do you implement income redistribution in an exchange rate-based program? You renegotiate wage contracts, you realign these contracts so that they approximate the true value, or that is what should be done. But now, instead of just approximating the true value, you give them an increase in real purchasing power. In other words, you inject an increase in real wages. And so the government takes advantage of the opportunity to renegotiate, because inflation eats up into your purchasing power. If you're a laborer and your wage is set to a contract, you will be paid this wage no matter what happens to the economy. If the economy experiences inflation, then your real wage shrinks. Once you renegotiate, okay, and you give them an increase in the real wages, a de facto increase in their real wages, then you have in fact implemented income redistribution in your country.
That assumes two things. One, that you stabilize the price at a higher price than it originally was.
Exactly. Or not relative to what it originally was, but relative to what it should be right now. Okay?
No, because of my second thing that I think you assumed, which is that the wage contracts were originally negotiated to their true value, which is not necessarily or even often the case.
Exactly. Exactly. That's right. It's usually indexed to the inflation rate. But if the inflation rate is galloping away,
Not only wages, also retirement may be
that's right.
index.
Well, if that is the case, then there is a stronger argument for why income redistribution causes the boom period. If the very nature of renegotiation is in favor of the laborer, then this P will not approximate its true value by any means. The wages, the real wages of these laborers will be an over-approximation, so that you cause the boom period. Right?
This phenomenon of increasing real wages will also tend to push inflation.
Not if, see, the point of renegotiating the wages, because the wage, what does a wage contract do? You are, of course, familiar with the wage spiral explanation of inflation, where this guy's wage causes an increase in the production price. The increase in the production price justifies an increase in this guy's wage, which increases the production. That's this wage spiral, right? And so wage contracts, which are indexed to inflation, sort of self-fulfill the actual inflation. Because if you keep on indexing it to inflation, it justifies more and more inflation until you have an explosive inflation in your economy. And if you stop it, let's say you choose this, just renegotiate it so that it approximates the true value, then you stop the wage spiral. Okay, how much money do you want? This is how much money I want. No, that's not your true value. This is now the purchasing power of the economy. I'm telling you now, you don't need to expect an increase in inflation next year. And so if I give you this wage, you should accept it. It's like a contract between the government, the company, and the laborer. The only reason the laborer wants more and more money is because the government is not in the contract. right? The government keeps on increasing inflation, and so the laborer will want to adjust with the company. Now, if the government, the company, and the laborer get together and the government says, okay, I promise, we will stop inflation, then the company and the laborer can set the price, the wage contract, and stabilize it at a certain point. Okay. Yes.
I was just wondering if you really need this populist policy explanation in order to explain why income is being redistributed. I mean, I think Professor Lowe yesterday gave his explanation of parts of the population not being in the banking sector, so they don't take
that is
advantage of the interest rate. And then I also believe that, I mean, inflation always works in the interest of people who have property and who don't rely on holding money balances, who have their property invested. And by the time you actually stop inflation, it just helps the ordinary people who just have, who basically get their wage and that's what they own. And then that's when they have something to spend again when inflation is down.
That is true if they have a lot of property, a lot of assets.
I mean, I'm talking of people who don't own assets.
Oh, okay. And so, oh yeah, exactly. Well, see, this argument was the basis for implementing a real wage redistribution, or real income redistribution. Usually it's because of a populist orientation. I'm not saying that, this is the main argument for it, but I was going to go to that next part, which is what you just exactly pointed out. That, so let's write it down. I just thought this is an important thing to note. It's not the main reason
Well,
by
I understood that way that a populist government will overdo it.
Yes.
And then, that's what he said basically, wasn't it?
And essentially, you can't accuse all populist government of wanting to do this. Of having been guilty of doing this.
Roman,
Yes.
to me that you are talking about populism. It's not a matter of a word. When you are changing the distribution between different level of incomes,
Yes.
you are changing in your economy. At the same time, the marginal propensity saving and the marginal propensity to consume.
Yes.
And then that might be the most important outcome of this stabilization process. Because when you are engaged in a stabilization process, the low income sector that we could assume that this low income sector have a higher marginal consumption propensity. Then now they have more resources.
Okay.
And then in the whole economy, consumption maybe goes up and saving maybe goes down. And what happened with your investments?
That is true. That is a very real issue. And if you assume that MPC and MPS will remain constant, if you implement this is a big change in the orientation of your economy. When you previously had chaos, now you have order. And so there could be a change in multiple variables as you implement the policies. That is a good point. I just want to get to that other explanation. Okay. The fact that you don't need a populist or explanation in order to, explain the boom in terms of an income redistribution. There is also a natural income redistribution which occurs with inflation stopping, in the same way that there is an income redistribution when inflation occurs. Okay? How does income redistribution occur when inflation occurs? If I owe you $10 and there is a 50% sudden inflation in the United States by next year, when I need to pay you back the $10, how is the income redistributed between us two?
You are taking away $5.
Exactly, right? I gain, you lose. And so the debtor gains, creditor loses. That is a natural income redistribution. It's not based on any populist policy. The other way, when it works in the reverse, when you stop inflation, inflation corrodes real income. Okay? It corrodes real income even more if you are not able to hedge against inflation. This is Professor Loyo's point yesterday. And so if you are marginalized from the banking sector, you don't know you received this amount of pesos and you are in a developing country this day, and you don't know that you should save some of it so that it will at least earn the inflation rate. If you don't understand that, because you're marginalized from the banking sector, then you will not be able to earn the real value of your money as time goes on. And so the value of your money corrodes. Everyone's money corrodes during inflation periods, but those who are marginalized from the banking sector have an even higher level of corrosion. Any questions there? And so, if you have an even higher level of corrosion and you suddenly have a stop in inflation, then you stop the corrosion and you have a de facto increase in the real value of your assets, of your money assets. That will justify a boom. Questions? Okey-doke. Last one is the bust. Okay, I only have one explanation for this bust period. And the bust occurs because of the real exchange rate appreciation. Okay. Why does the real exchange rate appreciate after a certain period of time when you have implemented an exchange rate-based stabilization program? Okay, that is the key question. Well, the answer to that question is the decomposition of the price levels in your economy. The total price level is just the average of all prices, right? Or a weighted average of all the prices. Okay. The consumer price index, as you know, is like a general indicator of the price level of an economy. But it is based on baskets of goods. The GDP deflator is another indicator of the price level in your economy. And it's based on the total output of the economy. Well, you can further decompose the price level. Okay. CPI and GDP deflator are whole price levels of the whole economy. You can decompose it into two parts, the tradable sector and the non-tradable sector. Why do we want to decompose it this way? Because the tradable sector will observe the law of one price. Law of one price. This is where the law of one price will hold. Right? If this piece of paper is a tradable good, then the deviation of the value of this piece of paper here in this economy relative to another economy will be arbitraged away. Why? Because if it has higher value there, you take this piece of paper to that other economy and sell it there. That action, that arbitrage action, will therefore make this piece of paper approximate its true value. This, however, cannot be arbitraged because you cannot transport the physical non-tradable good. If you cannot transport it, then it will not approximate its true value. It will stay relatively idiosyncratic. It's based on the characteristic of the economy where it is in. So it will not adjust in the same manner that this part adjusts. Okay? Now, if this guy does not adjust, what happens? Well, the candidate explanation is that there will be residual inflation after you implement an exchange rate-based stabilization program. And that residual inflation can be traced to this part the prices, the price of the non-tradable. Right? There can be no residual inflation in this part because everything here would have observed the law of one price. So all of the residual inflation will be here, which means the price of the non-tradable relative to the price of the tradable will increase. Okay. And when you have PNT over PT increasing, this is a de facto real exchange rate appreciation. Questions? Okay. This is where the residual inflation can be traced to. If that's where the residual inflation can be traced to, the reason for it is because this one will observe the law of one price. Any deviations between the price of tradables here in the US and abroad will be arbitraged away. Here, there is no arbitrage action, and so the residual inflation will most likely be here. If the residual inflation is there, the price of the non-tradable over the price of the tradable will increase, because this guy is still increasing while this guy has already stopped. If that happens, this is a de facto real exchange rate appreciation. Why? Because the domestic price is being influenced by the PNT part.
So do you mean the non-tradable goods are the domestic goods?
Yes. Wait. Domestic goods in the sense that they are only for domestic consumption. Yes.
Why, when the whole thing increases, there is appreciation for the currency?
Oh, because PNT. Good question. Is equal to, let's say this is big P, the general price level. It's just a weighted average of PNT and PT relative to how much of the economy is explained by the non-tradables. Now much of it is explained by the tradables. So you can put an, I don't know, an alpha, 1 minus alpha here. Something like that. If this is like 50%, that's 50%. If this is 10%, let's say it's the small part, the non-tradables part, it is still 10%, which will therefore cause this to still grow. If it's a big part, then you have more problems. It's a big part of your economy, only the small part will adjust based on the law of one price. And so there will be more residual inflation. Okay. Any other questions?
So normally the economy, the non-tradable part is bigger than the tradable part.
Ooh, I cannot really say if that is the case or whether that is a criterion for implementing this kind of a program.
No, basically to think about the effect of the bust.
Well, see, the thing to remember about this is that the exchange rate-based stabilization program is not just the exchange rate fixing, which means you are also implementing other things to control the non-tradables part, like the wage renegotiations. That is controlling the non-tradables part. Like labor is not fully mobile across countries. Okay.
We have first a boom, then a bust, and how to go up.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I forgot to explain the final thing for this. A real exchange rate appreciation causes what? When you appreciate your exchange rate, what happens? Okay, net exports goes down. Net exports is a component of K sub cross C plus I plus G plus NX. Therefore, IS shifts down. IS shifts down, output goes down. Right? Therefore, you have this part. Why will it go up? Is your question? I didn't really want to draw this part. So you just know that it goes down. As for this part, this is still going up, right? I'm not really sure. I haven't really thought about it. I just know that it follows the cycle.
Now you have a flexible exchange rate, maybe.
No, this is not a flexible exchange rate.
No, it's fixed.
Yeah. Actually, this going down part can cause a collapse of this exchange rate-based stabilization program. So you may not even observe that part anymore. A real exchange rate appreciation causes what to be fixed or pegged exchange rate. It causes
Depletion of the currency reserves.
the tie-back, speculative attacks, because it's now deviated from its true value, the real exchange rate. People see that, they attack your currency. That fix is the heart of this program. If they attack the heart of the program, then it could collapse. So yeah, it may not even go up at all. Well, if you float it, it will go up again because NX obviously will adjust.
That's why I think if it's the case of Brazil, you're floating, maybe you could push one more time from the bust to the boom.
True, but you will just go again to the bus later on.
That's right.
Okay, this should be quick actually. Money-based stabilization. Final thing to review for today is the other anchor. That first anchor is the exchange rate. This other anchor is the money supply. Okay. And if you use the real exchange rate equation there, you use PY for this one. Okay. And basically, what is the logic for this model? This will take me like 5 minutes to explain. One, you want to control objective. Control P. Right. Now, the way to control P is usually to control M. Right? And so, anchor M, stabilize P. Right? Now, when you stabilize P, something happens. I equals R by E. What happens to that equation when you stabilize P? It's not bouncing up and down anymore. It's becoming stable. It's not like that anymore. It's now closer to the central tendency. What happens to this? Which one goes down?
I don't expect it.
Exactly. The expected inflation rate will go down. People are now convinced that the P will be stable. So they don't expect future inflation anymore. If this goes down, I will go down 1 for 1. So this goes down as well, based on Fisher parity, Fisher theory. Right? Now, if I goes down, something happens. When I goes down, what happens? Again, our concept of opportunity cost. If your interest rate is lower, V will V will increase.
V?
Sorry, V will decrease.
Decrease.
Yeah. Always get this. V will decrease. What is the logic for this? And I just clarified this yesterday with Dr. Moyer. V is the rate of turnover or the number of transactions in your economy for a certain period of time. Right? Now, if you have a high opportunity cost, you will want more transactions over that period of time. Because you don't want to hold on to your money. I give you my $10 to buy something. You will not hold on to that $10 for long. You want to buy something immediately. Because the opportunity cost of holding the money is very great, if I is great. So the number of transactions increases if the interest rate or the opportunity cost is very high. If the opportunity cost is very low, the number of transactions also decreases. Okay, I had some problems with that logic too. It took me a while to but that is the explanation for it, Adam.
Can you just relate this MBI equals PY to the MB equals PY equation we saw a couple weeks ago?
MB equals PY?
Yeah.
Well, it's essentially the same thing.
Then where was the I before? What does the I do? What were we assuming about I before or something?
In a period of stable prices, the V will be constant. In a period of uncertainty and price chaos, which is what inflation is, the V will be responsive to the nominal interest rate. In this manner, a lower nominal interest rate means a lower V. A higher nominal interest rate means a higher V. And so here, if you have caused a fall in the nominal interest rate, you will cause a fall in the V. If the V falls, MB equals PY, this part goes down, this part has been stabilized, what do you need to do? You need to remonetize. That's what he was talking about yesterday. So, when you convince your people that your expected inflation will go down, your nominal interest rate immediately goes down with it. Once that happens, you will need to remonetize. Otherwise, this will provoke a what? If you don't remonetize, if you don't increase M, this will provoke what? Or this will induce what? This part is going down. So, something here must go down as well. Either P or Y. What will a P going down or a Y going down to? P in going down is what? Deflation. Y going down is what? Recession. Deflations usually precede recessions. So it's the same thing. If you don't remonetize, you have a recession. And so this is the time inconsistency. Well, not time inconsistency, but the problem with the exchange rate based the money-based stabilization is once you have convinced them, you must now remonetize. And the people cannot tell whether you are remonetizing to stabilize the V or you are remonetizing because you're up to your old tricks of increasing M to finance government deficits. So it's very hard to convince. See, it takes time to convince them, and once you have convinced them, first thing you do is to do something that does not convince, causes them to think of something else. And that is problematic. That is the review for today. Do you have any other questions?
When you say remonetizing, increasing the money supply.
Yes. This goes up so that it's kept constant. Okay. Thank you. See you next week.
Well, that's the final exam for this class.
When is the final? I'm not sure.